All right, we're back and let's talk about correlation research. So, got to get myself pushed here. So, in correlational research, there are going to be two variables. These variables are going to be measured. There's no control established in correlational research like there is in an experiment or even in a quasi experiment where we try and sort or something. In a correlational study, we're going to have two variables that have been measured in some way. So, for example, we might measure how much violent TV the child watches. And then we might also measure the amount of aggressive behavior that the child displays. So these are two different variables that can be measured independently. And we want to try and make some kind of prediction that higher levels of violent TV viewing are associated with higher levels of aggression, for example. So we want to make some kind of prediction based on the scores on these two variables as far as how they might relate to each other. The benefits of correlational research would be that we are able to establish the two variables go together in some way. We can't say that one's causing the other. My little diagram has an arrow flowing, and we can't say that with correlations. And I'll talk a little bit about why not in a second. But we can say that they go together. And that's really informative. I mean, you wouldn't want to jump directly into an experimental design that takes all this planning and attempts to control everything if you don't even know if the two variables go together, right? Like, you need to establish that before you attempt to go to the next level. The problems with correlations are that just because two variables go together doesn't really tell us anything about why they're going together or whether one of them is causing the other. Like, it doesn't really give us any of that information. And so it's kind of frustrating. Here's an example of, after interviewing thousands of people, I have found a strong correlation exists between being smart and agreeing with me. Yeah. Just because two variables go together doesn't mean that one's causing the other. So being smart doesn't cause you to agree with him, or agreeing with him doesn't make you smart, right? Like, we can't say that. All we know is that the two things are going together. And I'm not sure that agreeing with him really goes with being smart. But so let's talk about the amount of violent TV example and then the amount of aggressive behavior. Since we kind of started with the Bobo doll experiment, let's keep talking about, viewing violence and then behaving aggressively. So what a lot of people would like to argue is that watching a lot of violent TV causes aggressive behavior. But we don't know if the two things are causally related, if that's the way it would flow. It's just as likely that the amount of aggressive behavior causes the amount of violent TV viewing. Like, maybe people who are naturally more aggressive enjoy watching violent TV, right? So this is what we call the directionality problem. If there is, in fact, a causal relationship between these two variables, there's no way to figure out which direction that cause flows just based on a correlation. We'd have to follow up with an experiment in order to figure out which is causing the other. So when you see a correlation like this and somebody's trying to make the argument that the causation flows a particular direction, try and imagine, can I flip it the other way just as easily? Is it possible that it could flow the other direction? It might. And so that's a good sign that they might be arguing, from a position rather than just based on the correlational evidence. Let's talk about a third variable problem where maybe the amount of violent TV that the person engages in and the amount of aggressive behavior doesn't cause each other at all, but instead they're both being caused by the fact that the parents aren't home after school. That gives the kids freedom to watch whatever they want on TV, run the streets and get in trouble. There could be a third variable that's causing these two to appear to go together, when in fact they're only going together because of their relationship to the third variable. And if we didn't measure that third variable, if we didn't make sure that all the kids in our study had parents who were or weren't at home, if we didn't control for that variable, then there would be no way for us to figure out whether there's a third variable that's actually causing the relationship. So we have to be really super careful. So just like I said, a lot of the research that you're going to see in our textbook is quasi-experimental, even more of it is correlational. So when you read correlational research, just always think to yourself, can I flip the causation and it would still logically flow? Or can I think of a third variable that might explain why these are going together? And just be a little skeptical is what I'm saying. Here's an example. I found this in Parents Magazine a few years ago, and it says, brain food. Teens who steer clear of junk food aren't just thinner, they're also less likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. In a new study, kids who ate at least 2 fruit and 4 veggie servings each day and avoided fast foods, sweets, and soda were less likely to show symptoms of mental health problems. Researchers believe sugar and saturated fat may be damaging to the immune system, which in turn can raise the risk for psychiatric issues. All right, so the phrasing of this, which of course is directed at parents, is that if you can cause your child to eat healthy food, you can stave off depression and anxiety. If you can cause them to avoid unhealthy food, you can stave off depression and anxiety. The problem with this is that this research was correlational. So we could say, for one thing, that there might be a directionality problem, that being depressed and anxious may drive a child towards rejecting the healthy food and being attracted to the less healthy food, the fast foods and the sweets and so on. A lot of times when we're feeling a little blue, we're directed specifically towards the absolutely wrong kind of food because it has a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugars that will boost our mood, at least for a moment, make you feel a little bit better. And so being depressed may drive you towards the junk food. And this report is completely ignoring that. It's making it seem like the only causal flow is from the type of food you eat and then your psychiatric symptoms. The other thing is there might be a third variable present that determines what the person eats and how they're feeling, right? It might be difficulties at school that's driving food and mood. It could be the presence or absence of their parents in at home, and so they're eating better or worse than they would otherwise, and they feel better or worse than they would otherwise. So just always keep in mind, no matter how confidently it's reported as if like there's a causal flow that goes this one direction, always be thinking to yourself, what else, can I think about it? Can I twist it? Can I twist it back the other direction? Can I think of a third variable that might explain this relationship? The last method I wanted to talk about is frequently used in developmental research, so it's worth noting, and that's the observational method. There are 2 main types. There's the naturalistic observation, where you go to where the behaviors would naturally occur. You try to be as unobtrusive as you possibly can so as not to affect the behavior of the subjects that you're observing, and you record data about what they're doing that's relevant to your hypothesis. Oftentimes you go in with like checklists or other kind of prepared things. Maybe you have video cameras set up if that's allowable, things like that, so that you can see live behaviors that are just being naturally emitted by the participants. In a field study, you still go out to the place where the subjects would naturally be, but now you try to change something about the environment and see if it has an effect on their behavior. So for example, maybe we teach them something and then we turn them loose for free play and see if what we've taught them has an effect on their behavior. Something like that. I'm just making stuff up that go along with the pictures I'm looking at. So with a field study, the big difference is that we do something to see if it affects behavior. Naturalistic observation, we attempt to not affect their behavior at all. We just want to see how that behavior actually naturally occurs. The benefits of both of these methods is that you have more authenticity in your design, and so it's less likely that somebody could see your study and say, well, that's not how kids would really behave, for example. You had them in a laboratory and it was all artificial, and maybe that behavior was unique to the laboratory setting. Well, they can't say that here, can they? A lot of people said that about the Bobo doll study. Well, I mean, they're in an experimental situation. There's nothing else to play with. What else did you expect to have happen, right? You kind of entrapped them, basically, into behaving like that. Whereas with a naturalistic or field study, you could say, this is behavior that was probably going to be emitted anyway. And so it's got more validity. there are different kinds of validity, but this particular one has to do with, being in the natural setting. Problems with this design, naturalistic for one is really hard to implement. It is really super hard to be unobtrusive enough that the subjects that you're observing behave completely naturally in front of you. Having a new person in this daycare setting that's pictured would probably cause these kids to behave differently than they normally do. So, oh, well, we'll put cameras in there. Well, I mean, maybe that would be fine for children. Maybe they would not notice them. But with older people, which we oftentimes do naturalistic observations of family dynamics and other kinds of things, the adults are going to remember that there are cameras there and they may alter their behavior, right? So cameras are not necessarily the solution. Peeping at them through the window isn't necessarily the solution, because A, you better make sure you got permission for that, and then B, they might see you and that could alter their behavior, right? And you may not see everything because now you're peeping through the window and you can't even see the whole room. And so that's problematic. And another issue with both field study and naturalistic observation is that because it's not happening in a controlled situation, there are so many little clusters of kids that maybe in these pictures that you would be able to see, that you might miss some of the details. And so you might think that you did a really good observation, but you missed a lot of the information. And then the other thing is, a lot of times people go out to especially naturalistic observations, a little bit unprepared, thinking, well, I'll just get out there and see what's going on. I'll write it all down. It'll all make sense. And then they get out there and they realize, oh, wow, I needed to have prepared better. In fact, all this data is wasted and now I need to come back. And so it ends up actually being really super time consuming in the long run. So that's definitely a problem with these kinds of observational techniques, is that it causes you to have to go out of your academic setting that you're doing research for, go out into the world where you don't have very much control and where you better be really super prepared, or you're really not going to be able to, do a good, accurate observation. And it oftentimes turns out to be way more work than if you were to, try to control things more in a lab or something. And then with the results being kind of questionable in the long run because you didn't have control over a lot of things. So it seems like such a simple technique. I'll just go out and I'll watch the kids behave. And then in practice, it's really complex. So those are our basic research methods. Hopefully you found this stuff kind of interesting. I will wrap up. I gave you an apology in case my dogs barked, and luckily they didn't, but I will finish with a warning that this heater that you're hearing, and I'm assuming you can hear it because my microphone thing is showing it, it will be dogging us probably throughout the whole thing. So just FYI, that's my heater. All right. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in Chapter 2 next.